Thank you very much, Debbie. So I've been asked to kick off our discussion today by just reminding everyone about what the latest science tells us about climate breakdown. And then I'm going to say a little bit about how countries are doing in terms of performing against the Paris Agreement, which was the latest large and significant international climate change agreement that was made in 2015. And then talk a little bit about the negotiations that we're having in the UK later this year and what our expectations for that might be. So in terms of the latest science, unfortunately, things are still not looking particularly good. One of the sort of largest reports that I'd point people to who want to know more about expected climate change impacts is the special report written by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is this large group of scientists that bring together their evidence regularly in regular cycles. They did a special report on the impact of 1.5 degrees temperature increase around the world a couple of years ago, and those are still extremely relevant. What that shows us is that we're still expecting significant impacts on nature from our expectation of climate change, including, for example, on coral reefs. And we're on track at the moment to pretty much sort of destroy coral reefs, for example, completely, but also really significant impacts on people, predominantly the most vulnerable people at the greatest risk. So, for example, even at 2 degrees, we see sort of millions of people really will be subject to flooding, particularly coastal flooding, leading to probably death. So we have a number of really significant climate change impacts, and we're still unfortunately on track to those. If we look at what's happened in recent years, just this year, 2020, which for many of us seem to have passed perhaps in a haze, where all we've spoken about is the COVID pandemic, which has been, of course, devastating. We also have seen a 2020 that has been one of the warmest years on record as well, with over 50 million people globally recorded as being affected by floods, droughts, storms, all of the impacts that we know are at least in part due to climate change. And we've had, for example, significant wildfires with greater intensity in places like Australia, Brazil, Russia, and the US. And some of those have had really, really great prominence in the news. And so we can see that the impacts of climate change are affecting us now. And it's more and more that it's affecting us in all different parts of the world, as well as us having those expectation of significant impacts in the future. We are actually going to see the next of these big intergovernmental panels on climate change reporting in this coming year. So that will be giving us an update on the science, but don't expect any of those messages to be cheery. For example, some of the most recent science that has come out already this year is one that points to the impact of climate change expected on nature, that shows that it's likely that our most important endemic species, or the native species that are most suited to specific habitats, are most likely to be negatively impacted by climate change. So that means that specialist species that we see at home in our various homes in the world are most likely to be negatively impacted by climate change. And perhaps other species that have come and traveled from different parts of the world are more flexible and might thrive. And so we see that there's also a horrible connection between the worst impacts of climate change and also the threats that we see posed to biodiversity. From a people perspective, we also see, as I said before, that the greatest impacts of climate change are going to affect the most vulnerable people around the world and those least able to cope. So how are countries actually dealing with actually what they committed to doing in the Paris Agreement? And you can look at the Paris Agreement as including 3 important dimensions. One is greenhouse gas emissions, so committing to reducing those. The second is planning for and adapting to the inevitable impacts of climate change, some of which I've just spoken about. And the third is making financial commitments, particularly the wealthiest countries in the world, committed to releasing by 2020 $100 billion in annual funding for the less well-off countries to tackle climate change. So how are we doing against all of those 3 things globally? Well, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, unfortunately, they are still going up despite these commitments. So 2019 total greenhouse gas emissions, including land use change, reached a new high of 59.1 gigatons. We don't want to be reporting that kind of high, nothing to be proud of. And greenhouse gas emissions have grown around from 1.1 to 1.4% a year since 2010 on average. So, we're not seeming to do a very good job of actually reducing our emissions. In terms of adaptation, we can see that that countries are getting better about really across the board, and that includes countries for whom this might be quite difficult, figuring out how to adapt to the impacts of climate change and beginning to plan for that. However, it's going to cost quite a bit of money to do that, and those costs seem to be going up. So we still have what's referred to as an adaptation gap. So there's a really gap between what we know we need to do on adaptation and what we can do. That's the same as that gap between emissions that we need to reduce and the emissions that countries have committed to. And in terms of the finance commitments, it looks like countries might be on track to committing this 100 billion, but they also need to mobilize that, and this money needs to go to the right countries. So some progress is being made on things, but it's really not good enough or fast enough. So what do we want to see out of COP26? Let's talk about those three dimensions, which are really what the international negotiations will be focusing on. We need to see countries genuinely tightening up their what are called nationally determined contributions. These are their commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There was some progress made with the summit that Biden led last week, but those new commitments that came from a range of countries, from Canada to some added on to some existing commitments from the EU and China, narrows this gap of emissions reductions that we need to see to really reach 1.5 degrees. But we still have a gap of about 20 gigatons of annual emissions. If you think about the fact that on average, the world basically emits just over 55 gigatons a year. So we need to have a reduction 20 gigatons further in 2030 to actually reach 1.5 degrees. So a lot of work to be done. So some tighter commitments, please, for COP26 from all countries, and some countries have started to make those commitments. And we also need policies that support those broad strategic goals. And we also need these commitments to finance, to support the developing countries or those poorer countries, and also commitments to working on these adaptations to these impacts that we know will happen otherwise, and thinking about how we support each other, different countries, and how we learn better which types of adaptation actually work on the ground. So it's a reminder that we need to do everything, mitigation and adaptation, across all sectors, and all of us need to do that. And so we're hoping that COP26 will deliver tighter commitments from countries on all of those things. And I'll stop there.